It was a day Staff Sergeant Matthew Wilson had been waiting for years. An awards ceremony, a room full of service members, their families and friends, and a spotlight shining on the stage. Everyone expected his name to be called among those who would receive the military's highest award for bravery. But when the general walked out with the award in his hands, surprise flickered across many faces. The name that was called was not his. Matthew stood in the shadows, unnoticed. But when everyone had already started exchanging glances, and the tension in the hall became almost palpable, the host suddenly took the microphone and said a few words that made the hall freeze. What was announced was a real shock for everyone. What do you think could have happened at this ceremony? Write your guesses in the comments. And by the way, from what city are you watching this story? Matthew stood at the back of the room, erect as a soldier should. His heart pounded in his chest, and his gaze seemed to burn into the stage where the medals were being presented. He had always been a man of duty, accustomed to following orders without question. His actions in battle were an undeniable example of heroism, and many believed that he deserved the award, but his name was not called. Everyone in the room expected someone to correct the error, to announce another medal, but the announcer seemed to be moving on to his closing remarks. It seemed his contribution had gone unnoticed again. Like so many of the feats of black soldiers in times past, Matthew felt the injustice sting his pride, but he held back. He knew that complaining was not the way to go. He had known it since he was a child, when he had to fight for every opportunity in life. But today, something was wrong. Something had to be different. Suddenly, a shrill sound from a microphone broke the solemn silence. The general standing behind the podium hesitated. It seemed he had received some kind of message in his earpiece and now he didn't know what to do with it. His face became tense, as if someone had forced him to change his prepared speech. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," the general said after a pause. "I have just received an important message. Please remain where you are." The room froze, a whisper ran through the rows, and all eyes turned back to the stage. Something was clearly not going according to plan. It seemed that even the military themselves did not understand what was happening. The faces of high-ranking officers were distorted with incomprehension. Some of them looked at each other, trying to discuss what was happening without words. Matthew stayed where he was, mentally preparing himself for anything. He knew one thing: whatever happened, it was unexpected and important. At that moment, a tall man in a formal black suit entered the hall. He moved confidently, as if his every action had been planned long ago. The guards immediately made way for him, and the audience, fascinated by his appearance, fell silent. The unexpected guest approached the general and handed him something. The general turned pale as soon as he glanced at the document. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice became more restrained and serious, "I have been instructed to make an urgent announcement." He paused, apparently gathering his courage. The words came hard to him, as if he were being forced to change the course of the planned ceremony. Today's ceremony was supposed to end with the presentation of the last medal. The general continued, but it turned out that one of the most important awards was forgotten. It was intended for a man who deserved it more than anyone else present. Silence fell in the hall again. Everyone understood what he was leading to, but they were afraid to believe it. "Staff Sergeant Matthew Wilson," the general finally said, addressing Matthew directly, "come to the stage." Shock and amazement filled the room. Many of the spectators began to look around, searching for the soldier who had just been named. Matthew, who had not expected this turn of events, did not move at first. It took him a few moments to realize that it was true. It was his name. He had been called up to the stage. When he finally took the first step, the room erupted in applause. It was like a slow-motion movie. The sound seemed muffled, as if he were moving through a veil of water. Matthew walked through the rows, feeling everyone's eyes on him. When he walked onto the stage, the general extended his hand. But even here, on that podium, something remained unsaid. There was something more to this moment than just the award. The general handed Matthew the medal, but before he could pin it to his uniform, the lights in the room suddenly went out. It was pitch black, and a second later, a video began playing on the screen behind the speakers. It was footage from one of Wilson's most difficult operations. The screen showed the moment when Matthew single-handedly covered the retreat of his comrades under heavy enemy fire. He pulled a wounded soldier out from under fire, sacrificing his own safety. This was his true story, the story of a man who always put others before himself. Those who survived then, thanks to his courage, became living witnesses to his feat. When the video ended, the lights came back on. The general was visibly confused. "This video, it was not part of the ceremony," he said, "and I'm told it was transmitted to us over Defense Department security channels just a few minutes ago. Today, from this stage, it is officially announced that Staff Sergeant Matthew Wilson has been awarded not only the Medal of Gallantry, but the highest distinction that can be bestowed. He's not just a hero, he's a legend." At that moment, the room erupted in a deafening ovation, and Matthew, for the first time in his service, felt tears welling up in his eyes, not because he had been awarded a medal, but because he had finally been seen. Matthew stood on the stage, holding the medal in his hands, and looked out at the crowd in front of him. His heart was beating so loudly it felt like the entire room could hear it. He had just experienced a moment of recognition that was unpredictable and oddly well-timed, but something was still wrong. He had been trained to sense tension, to sense hidden threats, and now it was back. As the applause roared, he caught something in the movement of the people in the back rows. Someone was moving quietly toward the exit, not drawing attention to themselves. The lights didn't fully illuminate the room, and in the shadows Matthew could see the faintest movement of figures. One of them lingered by the door a little longer than he should have. Something was wrong. Who were these people? Was this part of the ceremony? His thoughts were cut short when the man in the black suit who had handed the general the envelope walked onto the stage. He took the microphone and said, "We have recognized the achievements of Staff Sergeant Matthew Wilson, but there is one thing that many of you do not know. This ceremony is only the beginning. Today, a secret that has been hidden for many years will be revealed. It is not only about Wilson's bravery, the fact is that his feat was much greater than we realize." The crowd, taken aback by the unexpected turn of events, fell silent. All eyes turned back to the stage. "Matthew," the man in the suit continued, "you didn't just save your comrades on that mission. You uncovered something that could change our history. And today, it's time for that truth to be known." Matthew felt his tension rise. He thought the day in question was long gone, buried in dusty reports and official papers, but something in the man's tone made him think he knew more than he was allowed to. "During that operation, you did more than just encounter enemy forces." The man's voice became more authoritative. "You accidentally discovered something that could have changed the course of the war forever. The documents we received this morning confirm that you witnessed a serious secret being hidden." Matthew remembered that moment now. On that mission, he had stumbled upon something strange: sealed containers in a ruined building, guarded not by ordinary soldiers, but by a special forces unit that didn't look like regular soldiers. No one could figure out what it was. The orders had been clear: leave and don't ask questions. But now, standing on that stage, he suddenly realized that those containers hadn't been forgotten. Their meaning was known, and someone was going to use that information right then and there. "This ceremony," the man continued, "is not just an awards ceremony. It is an exposé. We are not here just to honor a hero. We are here to bring justice." Those behind the operation knew about it from the very beginning, but they did everything to ensure that the truth remained hidden. Matthew felt a cold sweat run down his back. He knew there was more to the announcement, secrets that weren't being spoken about, and now that secret was being revealed. Suddenly, there was a crash at the doors of the hall. Several men in uniform rushed into the hall, exchanging glances and exchanging short orders over the radio. Their faces were tense, as if they were preparing for something inevitable. An uneasy silence hung in the hall. The man in the suit glanced quickly at the entrance and, without losing his composure, said, "Looks like the show is just beginning." Before anyone could react, the lights went out again and the room was plunged into pitch darkness. In the complete darkness, the room froze, as if everyone present was waiting for something inevitable to happen. Matthew felt a shudder run through his body. It was as if everything around him had suddenly become different. Familiar voices, the tramp of feet, whispers, everything sounded like a nightmare from which he could not escape. He stood on the stage, barely breathing, and felt the tension growing with each passing second. Suddenly the light came on again, but it wasn't the usual white light of the lamps, but a blindingly bright spotlight that hit the eyes sharply. It pulled only one figure out of the darkness, a man in a black suit who continued to hold the microphone. He looked calm, too calm for the chaos that was starting to flare up around him. "Everything that's happening here is not an accident," he said, looking around the room. "I knew they would intervene at this point, but they won't be able to stop the truth." Matthew suddenly realized that this man knew much more than he let on. His words were more than just a revelation. They were a threat. But to whom? The soldiers? The government? Or even Matthew himself? At that moment, armed men Matthew hadn't noticed before began making their way toward the stage. They moved around the perimeter of the room, as if driving everyone into a trap, and then something happened that no one expected. Right behind the uniformed men, a woman stepped out of the shadows. She was dressed in a simple business suit, and her face showed no fear or tension, only cold determination. "Sergeant Wilson," she said suddenly, loudly, and the room fell silent again. "You don't know the whole truth. You've been lied to all this time." Matthew turned to face her. He couldn't remember where he'd seen her, but her voice, it sounded like they'd spoken before. "This operation you took part in," the woman continued, "was part of a much larger game, but you were not the one who was to be used, but the one who revealed a plan that no one expected." Matthew looked at her, confused. He knew it was all connected to those sealed containers, that strange special forces unit, but he couldn't put it all together. "You think we're just talking about containers of classified information?" Her voice cut through the silence like a knife. "No, you found something more. Not weapons, not data. You found people. People they were trying to wipe off the face of the earth." The room froze, and all eyes turned to Matthew. Now he felt uneasy. People? He had seen a few strange figures that day, but he had thought they were enemies or agents. No one had said they were hostages or witnesses to something more. "These people are the key to everything," the woman continued. "And you, without knowing it, have become their protector. They are here today." As soon as she said these words, the doors to the hall suddenly burst open, and a group of people walked in, looking haggard but with bright eyes. Among them were men and women, dressed in ordinary civilian clothes. Their faces were unfamiliar, but one person stood out from the crowd. It was an elderly man with gray hair and deep-set eyes, who confidently stepped forward. "Matthew Wilson," he said, his voice heavy with grief. "You didn't just save us then, you saved a mission that could change the future." The older man came closer, his gaze piercing, like a man with nothing to lose. "We are those who were kidnapped and hidden from the world as part of experiments. We were used to develop a new kind of weapon, something that can manipulate people's minds. The containers you found contain not only documents, but also traces of these experiments. They were intended to destroy anyone who knew about them, but you were in their way." The man's words seemed to explode the silence in the room. Everyone finally understood that this was not just a battlefield feat, but something much darker and more dangerous. Matthew felt his heart stop. His life had turned upside down in an instant. He was no longer just a soldier. He was part of something that could change not only his fate, but the fate of the entire world. The silence was broken by a loud explosion outside. The people in the hall looked around in fear, and Matthew instinctively grabbed for his weapon, but it was not there. He was not prepared for this. Flashes of light and screams began to echo throughout the building. "They've come for us," the man said grimly. "Time is running out." The explosion shook the building, making the floor tremble underfoot. Panic filled the hall. Screams, stomping, anxious glances. People began to move in chaos, trying to get out, but there was no way out. The soldiers standing at the doors blocked all escape routes. The entire hall turned into a trap. Matthew stood on the stage, paralyzed by the suddenness of what was happening. The old man's words were still spinning in his head, still not fully registering in his mind. Experiments? People hidden from the world? He would never have thought that his heroism on the battlefield was connected to something so large-scale and dangerous. "We have to get out of here," came the woman's voice, the one who had spoken of truth and secrecy. She ran up to Matthew and grabbed his arm, pulling him along with her. "They won't let us get out if we don't hurry." "Who are they?" Matthew shouted, still not fully understanding who the enemy was. "Who's behind this?" The one who controls everything, she shouted back, not stopping. You should have seen their faces when you found those containers. You think it was just classified data? No, it was the beginning of the end of their control. Her words cut through his mind like sharp blades. Control, secret operations, and he had essentially uncovered it without even realizing it. Suddenly, one of the soldiers standing at the exit blocked their path. He raised his weapon, aiming at Matthew. The soldier's heart, accustomed to combat, responded instantly, a surge of adrenaline clearing his mind, but he was unarmed. What now? Everything seemed too chaotic. Before the soldier could pull the trigger, something flared in the crowd. It was one of the people the old man had brought. He raised his hand, and the next moment, the soldier standing in their way fell to the floor, as if his body had been suddenly turned off. The people around froze. What the hell? Matthew blurted out. We are not just victims of experiments, the man who had just dropped the soldier said quietly. We are the result of these experiments. Matthew's eyes widened in shock. This man had something that was beyond normal human comprehension. These experiments were designed to create people with special abilities, the woman explained, leading Matthew on. The government wanted to use us as weapons, but those who funded all this realized that control over people like us was power that could not be given up. We became a threat to them. Matthew glanced back at the older man who walked behind them, his eyes cold but focused. He, like the others, was a product of these experiments. Matthew felt that the truth he had just learned was much darker and more complex than just military secrets. They were heading for the side exit, but footsteps were already echoing down the halls. Reinforcements, a group of people, some of them experiments, were lining up around Matthew, as if they knew he was the key to their survival. You have to understand, said the woman, still leading him by the hand. They're not just after us. They want to take back control of you. You're part of this, even if you didn't realize it. We thought we were the only ones subject to these experiments, but what you did on the battlefield shows they may have planted something more. Matthew stopped abruptly, tearing his hand away from her grip. What do you mean, take back control? He asked, feeling his body tense with suspicion. What do you mean? The woman turned to face him, her face drawn with fatigue and worry. The day you found us, you became a problem for them. You were supposed to be removed from this mission, but you survived. It was no accident. You know that. There is something in you that they wanted to study, but they missed the moment. They knew that if you came back and told them what you saw, everything would be revealed. But now they don't just want to remove you, they want to take back what they put into you. Matthew felt a dull anger rising inside him. All these years he had thought of himself as a simple soldier, following orders. Now his world had been turned upside down, and he didn't know who he could trust. I'm not some kind of experiment, he shouted. I'm a man, a soldier. Everything I did in the line of duty. The woman shook her head. They've already changed you, she whispered. You just don't notice it, but you will soon. What's inside you will awaken. Matthew stood there in shock, his mind trying to piece together everything that had just happened. Explosions, people with incredible powers, hidden experiments, it all seemed absurd. But looking around, he saw the truth in their eyes. They won't let us go easily, the older man added quietly, coming closer. You're part of their experiment, Matthew. You're our key to freedom, and your fate is now tied to ours. At that moment, a second, even more powerful explosion was heard, and the ceiling of the building shook. The soldiers who had been standing on the perimeter began to attack. Gunfire rang out in the hall, and everything plunged into chaos. Matthew grabbed the nearest piece of furniture, preparing to take cover, but suddenly felt something strange. His body became light, as if every movement acquired an unusual force. The woman noticed this and smiled, barely noticeably. It's beginning, she whispered. Matthew didn't have time to answer. Everything before his eyes suddenly changed. The movements became faster. The sounds became clearer. He jumped forward, dodging bullets with an ease that was not available to him before. Matthew felt his body transforming, and at the same time, he was losing control of his emotions. Every movement was superhuman, as if he had gained new powers, but with them came an unbearable anxiety. The chaos around him was growing. People were screaming, running in panic, and the soldiers continued to fire into the hall. Matthew and his new allies were surrounded. The woman and the older man were at the forefront of the fight, but Matthew noticed that they were exchanging glances as if they had a plan. The older man soon informed the others of the plans they needed to implement, and despite the pressure of events, they moved confidently. "We need to get to the underground tunnel," the older man shouted, leading the group to a back exit that he said would lead to safety. "That's where we can get out." At that moment, Matthew noticed that the woman had fallen behind. She was struggling with one of the soldiers, but her movements seemed weakened. There was another soldier next to her, who was preparing to deliver the finishing blow. Without thinking, Matthew lunged towards her, feeling the strength filling his muscles. He caught the soldier in midair before he could strike, and threw him aside. The woman turned around and looked at him with gratitude and pain in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "but that's not all. They're not just hunting us. They want to destroy all traces of what we've done." "What did we do?" Matthew asked, turning sharply to face her. "What kind of experiments? Why are we here?" The woman was about to respond when an explosion in the hallway interrupted her. A chunk of the wall broke off, and smoke filled the space. In the cloud, Matthew saw women begin to fall to their knees, clutching their chests. He knew immediately that this was no ordinary chemical attack. This was a deliberate attempt to kill them. We will discover everything," the woman cried. "There are records in the dungeon that will explain everything. We must get there." But before they could take a single step, squads of soldiers began pushing through the rubble. An elderly man, seeing that they might be surrounded, threw a final grenade to create temporary cover. A loud explosion filled the area again, and smoke enveloped them. "Forward," he shouted, but his voice was broken by fear and pain. Matthew and the woman, following their new plan, continued on toward the underground tunnel, but as they made their way through the rubble, Matthew felt his inner tension grow. His hands shook with uncertainty, and he began to wonder what was really going on and how deeply he was involved. As they reached the underground entrance, Matthew noticed that their group had dwindled considerably. Several people, including an elderly man, had not lived to see this moment. The tunnel was dark and cold. The woman placed a glowing screen in front of her and played recordings that would explain their situation. The screen flashed images of research, labs, and people in white coats. Matthew saw experiments being performed on ordinary people, and technology being used to alter their abilities. But there was something else. Images from hidden archives, talking about plans that could change the course of history. This was all about creating control over people, the woman said. The technology we discovered was just the beginning. Now they will try to erase us and all evidence of our existence. Matthew tried to collect his thoughts. Everything he knew about his ministry now seemed a lie. He was part of something much bigger, much more dangerous. But there was one more question that was nagging at him. "Why me?" he asked, looking at the woman. "Why was I a part of this?" "Because you were part of their plan," she said. "You were placed into the army for a reason. Everything you endured was part of a test to determine how to control the likes of us. You were not just a soldier, but a catalyst that could destroy their plans." Matthew was shocked. He sat on the floor, looking at the notes, trying to figure out how all this could affect his future. Everything was jumbled up in his mind, and the only thing left was to act. He stood up, dusted himself off, and said, "We have to expose this. We have to tell the world what happened. It's the only way to stop them." The woman nodded. They both knew it wouldn't be easy, but they couldn't afford to lose hope. They continued watching the footage, knowing that the real battle was just beginning. Matthew and the woman continued to study the notes, trying to figure out what they were about to do. The tunnel was silent, except for the sound of dripping water. In this darkness, where every step could be their last, their plan became clearer. "We need to find a way to transmit this information," the woman said, her face illuminated by the light from the screen. "We need to get past the defenses and get to a place where we can deploy access to the network and publish everything we've found. That's the only way we can prevent further evidence from being destroyed and their plans from being ruined." "How are we going to do that?" Matthew asked, still shocked by what he had learned. "We don't know where it is or how to get to it." The woman turned on an old laptop, and a plan of the building they were in appeared on the screen. It was a drawing of an underground complex, containing many corridors and compartments. "We need to get to the surface," she began to explain. "There's an old archive center there where data and documents are stored. We can connect to the network and distribute information from there." An elderly man, who was still conscious but badly injured, handed Matthew a small radio and a map. "Right here," he pointed to the map. "That's the closest exit. We need to get there to get to the archive center. We'll create a distraction to give you a chance." "What's wrong with you?" the woman asked, her voice shaking with excitement. "We have a fight ahead of us," the older man said. "Not all of us will survive, but if we can hold them off, you may have a chance." Matthew nodded, feeling his heart clench with respect and sadness. They were willing to give their lives for this goal. With a plan in mind, Matthew and the woman made their way out of the tunnel, exiting through a hidden exit to the surface. The surface was covered in fog, and the moonlight created an ominous atmosphere. Matthew and the woman moved quickly and carefully, making their way through the ruined buildings and forests. They managed to get into the archive center, hidden deep in the former military base, where until recently they worked on projects related to experiments. As they entered the archive, Matthew noticed that the place was guarded. Several security cameras and guards patrolled the area. The woman used her skills to disable the security systems and turn off the cameras. "We must hurry," she whispered. "I will open access to the central server. While I do that, find important files and copy them to this device." Matthew began searching for the documents he needed, his heart pounding in his chest with fear and anticipation. He quickly found the folders marked confidential and for official use only that contained key data about the projects. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps and voices made him freeze. Someone was approaching the archive center. The woman was already working on connecting to the server, but now they had to hurry. "Matthew, I need a little time," she said. "Help me hold them off." Matthew grabbed the nearest weapon and prepared to face the guards. He felt the new power inside him allowing him to act with incredible speed and precision. The guards who entered the archives did not have time to understand what was happening, as they were already neutralized. The woman continued to work on the server, her fingers sliding over the keys. Soon she was able to access key files and begin downloading information. "Almost done," she said, "but we need to do it quickly." Suddenly, there was a sound of explosions. The building vibrated and several parts of the structure began to crumble. This was the beginning of a new attack. "Time's up," the woman cried, her face once again lit up with the successful download of the data. "We've gained access. We can send the information." She quickly activated the data distribution program, and notifications appeared on the screen that the information had been sent to several international news agencies and human rights organizations. Matthew felt his anxiety turn to certainty again. They had done everything they could. Now the truth was out in the open, and all they could do was survive and hope the world would react. As soon as the information was sent, the guards began to break into the archive. Matthew and the woman ran towards the exit to find a safe place. Suddenly, they came across a group of soldiers who were blocking the way. Matthew felt his strength fading, but he knew he couldn't give up. "We must break through them," the woman shouted. "It's our only chance." Matthew and the woman pulled themselves together and took action. Their powers, though not without limitations, allowed them to fight with a determination they had not had before. They fought their way through the soldiers, but not without losses. The woman, despite her remarkable abilities, was wounded in the process. Matthew felt her pain and knew their mission was not yet complete. They finally reached a safe place where they could hide. Matthew did his best to stop the woman's bleeding and keep her safe. He knew their fight was not over, but now they had a chance to change the future. Images of what had happened swirled in his mind. Experiments, technologies that could control people. He understood that they were part of something much bigger than just their own lives. "We did it," the woman whispered, barely opening her eyes. "Now the world will know the truth." Matthew nodded, squeezing her hand. He knew there would be hardships ahead, and a fight to restore justice. But now, with the knowledge that they could change the course of history, he was ready to face whatever challenges they faced along the way. Matthew and the woman took refuge in an old abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The night was calm, but the fear and tension were still there. The woman, who who introduced herself as Sarah, lay on an old couch, her wound treated, but still weak and exhausted. Matthew sat nearby, his mind racing, preoccupied with what would happen next. Now that the information had been relayed to the world's news agencies, governments and corporate bodies would have to begin to deal with what had happened. But what impact would it have? And how long did they have before those behind it all responded? Sarah, sensing his anxiety, said quietly, "We have done everything we could. Now we just have to wait and see how the authorities will react. But we must be prepared. They will be looking for us, and we must be ready." "Yes," Matthew replied, breaking away from his thoughts. "I still can't believe this happened. How can I be a part of this?" Sarah looked at him with compassion. "What you experienced was not just an accident. Everything that happened was the result of years of manipulation. But now you know the truth, and that is what can change everything." Matthew felt his resolve harden. He knew the fight was just beginning. They had to plan how to protect themselves and how to make sure the information they were passing on had the greatest impact. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, Sarah and Matthew received a message on the radio. It was from one of the international human rights agencies that had received the information and confirmed its authenticity. But there was also another message that a special task force responsible for destroying all evidence had been activated and was already moving in their direction. "We have to act quickly," Sarah said, sharpening her focus. "We have limited time to find cover and prepare for the next step." Matthew, despite his fatigue and fear, realized that they had no other choice. They had to find a way to ensure their safety and continue the fight. Their next target was a safe place where they could plan their next move. They moved to a more secure area, where an old, abandoned industrial complex was located. The complex was in perfect condition to be used as a temporary shelter. Sarah began to recuperate, and Matthew organized the defense. They set up barricades and monitored their surroundings, trying to detect any signs of an approaching squad. In the evening, as the shadows grew longer and night once again enveloped the city, they received an unexpected visit. A group of men dressed in dark clothing emerged from the darkness and entered the complex quickly and silently. They were armed and looked like they knew what they were doing. "Don't shoot!" one of them shouted, stepping out of the shadows. "We're here to help." Matthew and Sarah were wary, but they saw a familiar worry and determination in the eyes of the new arrivals. "We have received information about you," the group's leader continued. "We are part of an independent network that is fighting those behind these experiments. Our sources have confirmed your data. We are ready to help you destroy their plans." After a brief exchange of information, it turned out that the group was part of a resistance made up of former scientists, military personnel and activists who were aware of the existing projects and were fighting to expose the truth. Sarah, despite her fatigue, quickly took charge. She worked with her new ally to organize a plan of action. "We have to create a comprehensive campaign," she said. "We have to use every opportunity to spread the word, reach out to key influencers and create international pressure." Matthew helped organize secure releases and preparations for operations. He worked to strengthen relationships with media platforms and human rights organizations to ensure maximum coverage. Within days of the intense work, news of the scandal began to spread around the world. The documents they handed over stirred up the public and attracted the attention of human rights groups, who began pressuring governments to investigate. Meanwhile, Matthew and Sarah continued to communicate with international organizations, providing constant updates and responses to threats. Their previous hideout, despite its elaborate defenses, was soon discovered. The resistance group was forced to abandon it, moving to more hidden locations. One night, while Matthew and Sarah were holed up in one of these places, they were met by a mysterious visitor. The man introduced himself as a former employee of one of the research labs involved in the experiments. He reported that the key figures behind the projects were beginning to panic and take extreme measures to keep their secrets. "We need to know who is behind all this," he said. "The secret archives they are hiding contain names and details that could completely destroy their plans." Sarah and Matthew decided that this was their next step. They needed to get into the restricted areas to find and solve the remaining secrets. They returned to the city, preparing for the final push to find the truth. The situation grew more tense with each passing day. the military and intelligence agencies stepped up their operations to find and destroy anyone who might be connected to the revelations. Matthew and Sarah faced danger again and again, but their determination only grew. In the final, crucial operation, they found a way to infiltrate the main research lab where all the key data was stored. It was a difficult and dangerous undertaking, full of obstacles and complex security systems, but with the help of their new allies and their unique abilities, Matthew and Sarah managed to hack the systems and gain access to the deepest secrets. After examining the documents, they discovered that the project involved not only scientists and military personnel, but also high-ranking officials and influential businessmen. These people used their resources to cover up crimes and manipulate public opinion. With this new information, Matthew and Sarah knew that their next task was not only to expose it, but to protect those still involved in the project and ensure that all violators were brought to justice. The battle was far from over, but Matthew and Sarah knew they had done all they could to change the world. Their fight was now part of a global movement for truth and justice. The fire of determination in their eyes was once again lit, and they pressed forward, ready for the new challenges that lay ahead. Matthew and Sarah, aware of the importance of their latest operation, prepared for the decisive stage of their fight. They knew that infiltrating the main research laboratory would be the most difficult and dangerous step. The operation required perfect coordination and absolute stealth. When they reached the lab, the night was quiet, but tension was in the air. The resistance group that had prepared their path had already created a diversion to distract the guards. Matthew and Sarah infiltrated the building, using their skills and equipment to avoid detection. Inside the lab was everything they would expect: high-tech equipment, hundreds of files and documents, and multiple security systems. Every step was filled with fear and hope. Their goal was to collect evidence that could reveal the names of key figures and their crimes. They found the main server room, where all the critical data was stored. Sarah connected her devices and began extracting information while Matthew guarded her and removed barriers. A noise in the hallway made them freeze. The guards could return at any time, and every move could be their last. However, despite their efforts, their work was interrupted. Suddenly, an alarm went off. It turned out that one of the resistance group members had betrayed them. He had been captured by the guards, and now they knew where to go. Sarah fought the panic, but remained focused. She tried to finish extracting the data, but time was against them. Matthew felt his heart pounding in his chest, his fear and anxiety growing. They knew that if they didn't get away in time, they would surely die. When the information was almost completely extracted, Matthew noticed an alarm signal appearing on the monitor. Soon, the guards began to storm the lab. Sarah and Matthew found a way out, but it was blocked. There was only one way out, through the ventilation system. In their last attempt to evade capture, they crawled through the narrow ventilation ducts. They were exhausted and almost out of strength, but they continued to move forward. Suddenly, Sarah fell, her leg trapped in the narrow space. Matthew tried to help her, but the noise of the guards was getting closer. "Save yourself," Sarah said, her voice full of determination and fear. "I can't go any further. Go away." "No," Matthew replied. "We'll get through this together." But Sarah, realizing that her injuries were serious, urged Matthew to continue. He, broken and dejected, continued on and made it outside. When he returned to the surface, he saw their shelter engulfed in flames. There had been an explosion in their shelter, and everything they knew had been destroyed. Matthew knew his companions and allies were dead. He felt guilty for not being able to save them, and bitter at the betrayal. The entire operation had been a disaster, but he couldn't stop. Now all the information they had gathered had to be transmitted to the world. Over the next few days, Matthew used the remaining data to contact international human rights organizations and journalists. He worked around the clock to publish the revelations. Despite constant threats and harassment, intelligence operations continued, and Matthew was forced to hide, moving from one safe house to another. One day, he received a message that his actions had caused an international stir. The crimes found in the data attracted the attention of world leaders and human rights groups. Official investigations began, and some of the key figures behind the projects were arrested. However, the victory was bittersweet for Matthew. He continued to be tormented by the memories of what had happened. The fall of his team and the betrayal left deep wounds. At night, he often woke up from nightmares, seeing the faces of his fallen friends and tormented by feelings of guilt. One cold morning, when news of revelations and investigations became regular, Matthew decided to visit one of the sites where the experiments took place. He saw how the buildings were destroyed and the ground was covered with traces of past horror. This place became a symbol of destruction and tragedy, but also of hope for justice. Matthew found traces of his comrades and was able to make tombstones for those who died. He prayed for their souls and for the world they were trying to save. He promised himself that he would continue to fight for truth and justice, despite all the trials. Ultimately, the story they uncovered changed the world. But for Matthew and Sarah, their personal sacrifices and tragedies remained alive in their hearts. Matthew, despite the bitterness of his loss, became a symbol of the fight for justice, and his efforts became an example of how even in the darkest circumstances, a light of hope can be found. Despite Matthew's best efforts to remain in hiding and try to rebuild his life after the disaster, his inner demons would not leave him alone. Since his last successful exposure, he has become a symbol of the fight for truth and justice, but his personal tragedy has left deep marks on his soul. A few months after the revelations were published, Matthew found that his personal details had become public knowledge. He began receiving threats and messages from those who were part of the covert projects. Security services informed him that he needed to remain in complete hiding until the investigation was completed. It was a hard life of constant fear, but he knew his work was not done. One evening, as he sat in his temporary safe house, he received a message that would completely change his perception of what was happening. A well-known journalist who had helped spread the revelations told him that there was new evidence in one of the closed archives that could link the top of the organizations to a wider conspiracy. Matthew immediately set out for the city where the archive was located. It was a complex and dangerous operation that required all of his skills and determination. He knew that if he could obtain this information, it could finally destroy the structures behind the experiments and manipulations. Breaking into the archive was no less difficult than breaking into the lab. He used all his skill to bypass security systems and get rid of guards, but when he got to the documents he needed, he found something unexpected: evidence that linked the projects to high-profile political figures whose names had been hidden until now. While Matthew was working on the documents, he heard footsteps approaching. Suddenly, the archive door swung open and several masked men with guns entered the room. One of them was the same traitor who had betrayed them earlier. He had been part of the security and was now acting as an agent of the hostile group. "I thought you could escape," the traitor said mockingly. "You know too much." Matthew, trying to remain calm, quickly gathered all the documents and hid them in a safe place, but his opponents had already surrounded him. He knew that he could not fight them and protect the information he had collected at the same time. In the chaos that followed, Matthew managed to block access to the documents and escape the building. He felt fear and adrenaline fighting in his blood. He managed to hide in the crowd and return to his temporary shelter. The next morning he learned that the archive had been blown up. The explosion had destroyed all traces that could confirm his suspicions. Matthew was devastated, realizing that his actions might have been in vain. During this time, Sarah, although seriously injured, had managed to recover and continued to work behind the scenes. She contacted Matthew and proposed a new strategy. Together, they decided to use the information they had managed to save and appeal to international human rights organizations to continue to pressure the authorities and reveal the truth. Their work together led to the creation of a new network of whistleblowers and activists who continued the fight against those who tried to destroy their work. Despite the difficulties, they found new ways to highlight issues and combat global conspiracies. Sarah and Matthew still faced threats and harassment, but they realized their work was just beginning. They began helping others who had been similarly manipulated and building a movement for transparency and justice. The tragedy that befell them did not break their spirit. Instead, it became an incentive for them to continue to act. Matthew and Sarah continued to fight for the truth, even when the world around them remained dark and dangerous. One day, when the situation on the international stage began to stabilize and investigations continued, they received good news. Many of the key figures involved in the experiments had been arrested and brought to justice. Matthew and Sarah knew that their fight had not been in vain. Matthew found the strength to continue his life, although not without difficulties. He became a symbol of hope for many and continued to work on projects aimed at preventing similar abuses in the future. His and Sarah's lives were no longer the same, but they found solace in the fact that their efforts had made the world a little better. Matthew and Sarah's story is a reminder that even in the darkest hours, there is a light of hope to be found, and that the fight for justice requires both sacrifice and determination. After Matthew and Sarah recovered from the tragedy, their lives took a new direction. Despite constant threats and dangers, they decided to continue their fight for truth and justice. Their goal now was to create a global alliance against the abuses they had uncovered and to find ways to prevent similar crimes in the future. One day, while Matthew was reviewing new data, he came across information about a strange and secretive organization called the Order of the New Order. This order was known for its large-scale operations that involved high-level manipulation and control of the world's largest resources and technologies. Apparently, they were inextricably linked to the projects that Matthew and Sarah had exposed. The order had a network of agents and informants all over the world, making them extremely difficult to detect. Their activities were carefully hidden under a veil of secrecy and disinformation. However, Matthew was confident that finding their founders and uncovering their plans could be a key step to ultimate victory. Sarah, still struggling with the effects of her trauma, supported Matthew in his decision to investigate the order. They began gathering information using their old connections and new sources. In parallel, they organized groups of activists and journalists to create international pressure on the authorities and major corporations. One of the first significant findings was testimony from a former member of the order who had defected and offered to help. The man, named Jake, was a senior analyst with access to key data about the order's plans. He agreed to cooperate with Matthew and Sarah in exchange for protection and restitution for the damage he had suffered due to his previous activities. Preparations for the next operation were intense. Matthew and Sarah established contacts with several global agencies and intelligence services to create a plan to expose the order. They learned that the order was planning a large-scale operation to manipulate financial markets, which could affect the stability of the global economy. Sarah, despite her physical condition, worked on coding and encrypting the data they planned to use for the expose. Matthew focused on gathering information on the order's key figures and their plans. Jake gave them access to internal networks and plans, which allowed them to discover several potential targets for their operation. One night, while Matthew and Sarah were analyzing the data they had received, they managed to find information about an upcoming meeting of high-profile members of the order in one of the secret safe houses in Europe. This was their chance to penetrate the heart of the order and get the evidence they were looking for. The operation to infiltrate this safe house was risky. Matthew and Sarah, armed with new intelligence and the support of their allies, prepared for the task with the utmost caution. They used the latest technology and stealth techniques to avoid detection. Upon arrival, Matthew and Sarah were confronted by security that was equipped with high-tech security and armed to the teeth. They used their skills and experience to bypass the defenses and get inside. Matthew was able to detect weaknesses in the security system, and Sarah, despite her injuries, was able to operate the equipment effectively. When they got to the room where the meeting was taking place, they saw high-profile members of the order discussing their plans. On the monitor screen were displayed charts and plans for manipulating the financial markets. This was confirmation that the order was ready for a large-scale operation that could cause an economic crisis. Matthew and Sarah quickly wrote down everything they saw and began preparing to evacuate. But as they tried to leave the area, they were discovered. A tense chase ensued, and they were forced to use all their skills to escape the trap. During their escape, they met unexpected allies, local activists and informants who helped them evade capture and escape to safety. These new allies informed them that the order had already planned their elimination and that information about the order's plans must be transmitted immediately to avoid disaster. Sarah and Matthew, now surrounded by allies, began working on a plan to spread the word. They knew that to stop the order, they had to act quickly. They contacted international financial institutions, human rights groups, and the media. International events began to unfold rapidly. The information Sarah and Matthew provided led to global investigations and responses from governments and organizations. The order faced pressure that could not be ignored. However, despite their success, Matthew and Sarah's personal lives continued to be difficult. Their constant movement in secrecy created an emotional burden. Matthew also began to feel the increasing pressure of being under constant threat, and this began to take a toll on his mental state. One evening, while Matthew was trying to calm down, he received news that his closest ally and friend, Jake, had been kidnapped. This event was a blow to the entire operation and forced him to focus on his personal safety again. Sarah and Matthew decided to continue the fight and prevent the order from winning. They focused on saving Jake and ensuring the safety of all those who supported their cause. The last part of their fight involved preventing the order's final operation and uncovering the last secrets. In the final operation, they discovered that the order had planned massive data destruction and public opinion manipulation to cover up their crimes. With the help of their allies, Sarah and Matthew launched a final attack on the order's main hubs. In a tense and dramatic ending, Matthew and Sarah, using the last of their strength, managed to thwart the order's plans and leak all the information to the world media. Global public opinion began to put pressure on the authorities, and finally the order was exposed and destroyed. Matthew and Sarah knew their work was not over. They continued to reach out to human rights groups and international organizations to ensure that similar abuses would not happen again. Their fight for truth and justice made them known around the world, but the personal tragedy and hardship they faced remained with them forever. The story of Matthew and Sarah has become a legend of courage and determination, of how even in the darkest circumstances one can find the light of hope and fight for a better future. After Sarah and Matthew exposed the order of the New Order and their plans were revealed to the world, they began to consider their next steps. But, as is often the case, no matter what, nothing ends easily. Despite their best efforts, the world has not become much safer. New intrigues have begun to emerge around their actions, and new, dangerous forces have drawn attention to them. Sarah and Matthew decide to take a short break to recuperate, but their peace is short-lived. One day, while Matthew was reviewing new data on international investigations, he noticed a strange anomaly. In one of the files, which seemed incomplete, he noticed an encrypted message indicating a connection to another hidden alliance. This was something larger and more sinister than the Order of the New Order. This alliance was called the Shadow Alliance, and it operated on a higher level than they could have imagined. Matthew shared this discovery with Sarah, and they decided to look deeper into what this alliance was. They soon discovered that the Shadow Alliance was a secret organization that had access to international finance, government structures, and even intelligence agencies. The alliance was originally created to manipulate global events to steer them in the right direction for their own benefit. Sarah and Matthew began gathering information about the Shadow Alliance. They found out that the alliance was responsible for many major global crises, including economic crises and even military conflicts. It turned out that they were using the Order of the New Order as puppets to carry out their plans. But the most shocking twist came when they learned that one of the members of the Shadow Alliance was a man they thought was an ally. That man was Jake, their former informant who had disappeared months ago. He had become deeply involved with the alliance and was now on the enemy's side. Sarah and Matthew, shocked by Jake's betrayal, realized that they had to be especially careful now. They began searching for Jake and tried to figure out his motives. After a thorough investigation, they learned that Jake was recruited by the Shadow Alliance under threat of his family's lives. He was forced to work for them to protect his loved ones. Meanwhile, the Shadow Alliance began the active phase of their plan, attempting to create a crisis that would further increase their influence and control. Their goal was to spark a global conflict that could lead to dramatic changes in international politics and economics. Sarah and Matthew, realizing the scale of the threat, decided that the only way to stop the alliance was to find and expose its top leaders. They organized a dangerous operation to infiltrate the closed meetings and hidden databases of the Shadow Alliance. During one of these operations, they unexpectedly encountered Jake. It was in a deep underground complex where the alliance held its secret meetings. Jake, surprised by their appearance, first tried to defend himself, but then confessed his betrayal. Jake explained that his family was under threat and that he was forced to help the Alliance to keep them safe. He also revealed that there was a plan in which the Alliance was going to use mass disinformation to deceive the world community and create internal conflicts within countries. Matthew and Sarah, torn between their desire to save Jake and their need to stop the Alliance's plan, decided to help him. They offered Jake a deal. He would help them expose the Alliance and save his family, and they would provide him with protection. An elaborate plan to destroy the Alliance began to unfold. Matthew, Sarah, and Jake devised a strategy that involved leaking classified information and creating false leads to distract the Alliance from the real operations. They began to act, and soon the world began to notice signs of global disinformation. The operation reached its climax when Matthew, Sarah, and Jake infiltrated the Shadow Alliance headquarters. There, they discovered the central server that controlled all Alliance operations. In a tense scene filled with action and betrayal, they were able to download all the data and begin distributing it. But at the very last moment, when it seemed that victory was at hand, Jake was captured by Alliance guards and his family was in danger. Matthew and Sarah, with no time to think, decided that saving Jake and his family was the most important priority. In a dramatic finale, they staged a rescue mission and were able to get Jake and his family out of danger. The Alliance's plans were destroyed, their covert operations were exposed, and their key members were arrested. Matthew and Sarah were able to prevent a global crisis, but at great personal and emotional cost. The story of Matthew, Sarah, and Jake was not only a testament to their bravery, but also an example of how, in the shadow of great conflict and betrayal, people can find a path to truth and justice. Ultimately, they realized that their fight for truth was not only personal, but also part of a global quest for a better future. After Matthew, Sarah, and Jake exposed the Shadow Alliance's plans and saved his family, they found themselves in the spotlight. The story of their fight against the world's hidden manipulators became an international sensation. Despite their apparent victory, they knew their lives would never be the same. Sarah, Matthew, and Jake knew that their actions had attracted the attention of not only grateful individuals and human rights groups, but also those who continued to threaten their safety. Matthew and Sarah were being hunted by the remaining Alliance loyalists who were trying to reorganize their forces and regain control. The disinformation they had previously uncovered had only made matters worse, creating a slew of false leads and false accusations. Despite the dangers, the trio decided to use their new status to continue fighting for the truth. They became the faces of an international campaign to expose high-level corruption and manipulation. Sarah and Matthew worked to create a foundation that supported activists and investigations around the world, while Jake took on the task of rebuilding and protecting his family. Their campaign quickly gained momentum. The New World Foundation became an important tool in the fight for transparency and truth, drawing attention to issues of corruption and injustice. But behind the successes were personal difficulties and sacrifices. Matthew and Sarah, often forced to change their location due to threats and constant pressure, began to feel physically and emotionally exhausted. Jake, now with his family under protection, decided to use his connections and knowledge of hidden structures to actively fight the remaining parts of the Alliance. His work was important, but difficult. Jake discovered that some former members of the Shadow Alliance had begun to act more covertly and create new fronts for their activities. One day, Sarah received an anonymous message with information about a new threat. The message indicated that several high-profile political figures previously associated with the Alliance had begun preparing a plan to create a new global crisis in order to distract the public and restore their influence. Matthew and Sarah decided to immediately look into this information. During their investigation, they discovered that behind the plans was a powerful financial magnate who used his resources to manipulate political and economic structures. This magnate, named Gregory Albertson, was one of the most powerful men in the world and had deep connections to the remaining elements of the Shadow Alliance. Sarah and Matthew devised a plan to expose Albertson and stop his actions before they could carry out their plan. They knew it would be dangerous, as Albertson had significant resources and security. They contacted international agencies and activists to create a coalition to counter the threat. During this time, Jake, who continued to work on exposing the Alliance's remaining structures, learned of secret meetings between Albertson and his closest associates. He was able to infiltrate one of these meetings, where he learned key information about the magnate's plans. He passed this information on to Matthew and Sarah, who in turn began preparing an operation to stop Albertson. The operation began with false leads and disinformation to distract Albertson from their true intentions. Matthew and Sarah used their resources and connections to create a situation in which Albertson was confident that his plans remained safe. However, they also worked hard to gather evidence and expose his actions. Albertson's headquarters, where key documents and information about his plans were stored. Sarah and Matthew worked together to bypass complex security systems and find the necessary evidence. When they reached their target, they found not only information about the plans, but also Albertson's personal connections to other influential figures. However, when they attempted to leave the building, they were discovered. Albertson's security was ready to attack, and a tense chase began. Matthew and Sarah were able to evade capture, but their actions attracted the attention of the public and the media. Soon, the exposure of Albertson's plans became a worldwide event. The story of their struggle continued to unfold in international news. Global investigations began, and many high-profile figures associated with Albertsons were arrested. Matthew, Sarah, and Jake, though tired but satisfied with their accomplishments, continued their work through the foundation and activism. But even after all their successes, they knew that the real fight for justice never ends. New threats and challenges continued to arise, and their work remained difficult and dangerous. However, they continued to move forward, believing in the power of truth and justice. At the end of their story, Matthew, Sarah and Jake discovered that despite all their sacrifices and hardships, their efforts had brought about a meaningful result. The world had become a little more transparent, and their actions had become a symbol of the fight for justice and truth. Their personal sacrifices and hardships were not in vain. They became legends and an inspiration to many who continued to fight for justice. Sarah and Matthew returned to normal life, although not without traces of their previous trials, and continued to work to improve the world. Jake, who had rebuilt his life and family, became an activist and an expert in exposing corruption. They all understood that the world required constant struggle, but their stories served as proof that even in the darkest corners, there is a light of hope and change. After Matthew, Sarah, and Jake successfully exposed Gregory Albertson's plans and destroyed the remaining structures of the Shadow Alliance, their efforts led to significant changes in the global community. Their work bore fruit, and the world began to recover from numerous manipulations and crises. Sarah and Matthew, despite everything they had been through, felt relieved. With Albertson's plans exposed and high-profile corrupt officials exposed, their lives began to return to normal. They continued to work to strengthen the New World Foundation, which had now become an important tool in the fight for transparency and truth. Sarah, with her outstanding analytical skills, focused on developing programs and initiatives to support young activists and human rights defenders around the world. Matthew, although tired but determined, continued his work, helping to build bridges between different organizations and human rights groups. Jake, who was able to find peace again after saving his family, became a prominent public figure and activist. His knowledge of hidden structures and experience in fighting corruption allowed him to become an important consultant for many organizations. He also began collaborating with human rights organizations to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. Despite all the challenges, their personal lives began to improve. Sarah and Matthew found solace in the fact that they were able to create something positive out of their previous trials. Their work, although filled with difficulties, brought them satisfaction and pride. Soon after, Sarah and Matthew decided to take a vacation to rest and recuperate. They went to a quiet and picturesque place, away from the hustle and bustle of the city and the constant pressure. This time gave them the opportunity to relax and enjoy the simple pleasures of life. They felt close and supportive again, and their relationship became stronger than ever. Jake also found happiness. After many months of work and struggle, he was able to reunite with his family and spend time with loved ones. He began working on a book in which he described his adventures and fight against corruption, hoping to inspire others. Their efforts did not go unnoticed. The international community began to actively support their work, and the New World Foundation continued to expand and strengthen. Their work helped to uncover new cases of corruption and protect the rights of people around the world. Matthew and Sarah have also become key figures in a number of global initiatives to raise awareness and support for the fight against injustice. Their work has inspired many and led to the creation of new alliances and movements aimed at creating a more just and inclusive world. The happy ending of this story was not only in their personal lives, but also in the fact that they were able to create a lasting legacy. Their fight for truth and justice brought about a change in the lives of many. They knew their work was not yet finished, but they could now look to the future with confidence, knowing that their efforts had made the world a little better. Matthew, Sarah, and Jake, each in their own fields, continued to contribute to a more just society, and although many challenges still lay ahead, they were determined to continue the fight, to support and inspire others on the path to a brighter future. The story of their struggle and victory has become a symbol of hope, showing that even in the darkest times, light can be found and that courage and determination can lead to significant change. If you like the story and want to know more about the adventures of Matthew, Sarah, and Jake, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment. It is important for us to know your opinion and find out what you liked most about this story. What part of the plot impressed you the most? What moments did you find most exciting or unexpected? We'd love to read your thoughts and discuss them with you. Also, if you have any ideas or suggestions for new stories, please share them. We are always looking for inspiration and new interesting directions for our stories. Thanks for being with us.